analysis for you today. Two teams from the graduate Practicum in Public Policy. So Christine and I have been working on this year. You guys know Christine, I hope, at least a few of you do. And let me introduce the first team, the team to go first. I don't want to say team, the A team. Maybe, anyway, you guys decide if they're the A team. And so Nicole, Hensel, Amanda Liu, and Anne-Marie Gordon are going to look at alternative school accountability in California. Specifically, they are looking at a case study in San Jose Unified School District, and they did this work for the State Board of Education, whom they briefed last Monday, I think it was, something like that. And the second team is Benji Nguyen, Annabelle Wong, and Silas Vola right over here. And I don't know the official title of your presentation, but it's riveting. No, it's not riveting. What's the title?
We gave it to your recommendation. Policy responses to increase bank loans to municipal government.
Policy responses to increase bank loans to municipal governments. Right, okay. And that is for the Volcker Alliance, and we're really fortunate to have their client, Bill Glasgow, who came out all the way from New York City for this presentation. And each team will have about 45 to 50 minutes, so about 30 minutes for presentation, then we'll do 20 minutes of Q&A. The first question is always reserved for Greg Roskin, who's the director of the public policy program. That's how it always works. And we'll go from there. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Before we get started, we'd like to thank the public policy program, Greg, and definitely Joe and Christine, who have been so helpful throughout the Practicum project. So thank you all for your support, and we're very excited to present to you today. So Joe kind of already gave an overview of what we'll be presenting on, but is alternative school accountability in California. Just context before this, all of our results are context specific to San Jose Unified School District. So many of the recommendations, we just want to make sure that we're in full transparency. This is specifically context specific to San Jose Unified. So before we get started, if you could just briefly review the agenda for today. And you'll find at the end that we will be presenting the same findings and recommendations that we presented to the State Board of Education last week. And then there will be time at the end for questions. Great, so just a couple of introductions of who we are. All three of us are joint degree students simultaneously pursuing a master's in education at the same time as our master's in public policy. The three of us are also former educators. And the Practicum project, as many of you know, is our capstone project for our public policy degree. It's a client-facing project that involves some quantitative and qualitative policy analysis. And our client for our Practicum project was the California State Board of Education. And what the California State Board of Education asked us to do was address a gap in their knowledge about their accountability system, specifically as it relates to alternative schools, which we will describe in detail both the alternative school model in California as well as the accountability structure. And their ask to us was what indicators could predict success at alternative schools. And this research has been done in parallel research with the Gardner Center for Youth and their communities. They are looking at 5 large school districts across the state, and so and they did not have San Jose data, so we decided to dig into that data and conduct research alongside them.
So with, you can keep it. So background for alternative schools and alternative education in California. In general, the principle underlying alternative education is flexibility and accommodation for students who are not flourishing in the traditional education system. So broadly in California, the main categories of alternative schools and programs that are offered are continuation schools, which are for students who have been deemed credit deficient by their district or county and need to be able to make up credits at a faster rate than they can make at their traditional school in order to graduate in a normal time frame. In addition, there are community schools which can be operated either by a district or by a county, and those are schools that are for students who have disciplinary action against them, have been expelled, suspended, and need to enroll in a school that is not essentially operated by the traditional school system. And then finally, there are a very wide range of voluntary choice schools, which can be virtual schools, that's homeschooling, some charters qualify and are classified as alternative schools, magnet programs. That list is very, very broad, and the types of alternative schools and programs that are offered vary also a lot district to district and county to county across the state. This is what alternative education looks like in San Jose. There are basically these two buckets. First, Broadway High School is the continuation high school that is operated by the district. Community schools are operated by the county, so none of those students who have been expelled continue to be enrolled by San Jose Unified School District. Then the rest of the programs in alternative education that are available in San Jose are operated through their alternative learning options department. Actually operated on their campus are only Liberty High School, which is an independent study program where students come in once a week for very intensive one-on-one time with a teacher, and then they do the rest of their work at home. These are often students who are working or have other obligations outside of, in their lives outside of their lives as students that require more flexibility. Then home studies is what most of us know as homeschool, where students, their parents are very involved in their education, but they do often come in for check-ins at alternative learning options to make sure that they're making sufficient academic progress. Then the Silicon Valley Career and Technical Education Center is operated on its own campus, and students in alternative schools and traditional schools enroll there for career and technical education courses. And then finally, Middle College at San Jose City College is for students who are more advanced and are trying to pursue high school and college credits simultaneously. That is really the main program that is available for students who are making faster than normal academic progress. The rest of the alternative options for students in San Jose are focused on students who are behind and often are trying to make up credits or find a learning environment that is more amenable to their learning needs.
Great, so now that we have a background of what alternative schools look like in San Jose, we're going to also give a brief overview of what the accountability system is currently like for public schools in California. So the federal Every Student Succeeds Act, which was just recently passed through Congress, has 4 main criteria for an accountability system for high schoolers. The first is that there needs to be some sort of high school graduation rate. Right now, California is using the 4-year cohort graduation rate, meaning what % of students that entered 9th grade together are graduating 4 years later in 12th grade. The second is proficiency on assessments. Right now, California is using the Smarter Balanced Assessment, which is a Common Core aligned standardized test. The next is a non-academic indicator. This is a new addition from the Every Student Succeeds Act from No Child Left Behind. And California is using suspension rate, a local climate survey, and will be using chronic absenteeism in the next fall. And then finally, there is progress of English language learner proficiency, which right now they are using the California English Language Development Test, also known as the CELT. You'll notice that in terms of alternative school indicators, this area is blank right now because currently there is no formal accountability structure for alternative schools. What the state board was finding was that when they were using these measures to hold schools accountable, that alternative schools were always ending up in the bottom 5 percentile of all schools. And they were recognizing that the work being done at alternative schools is different than at traditional schools, and maybe that these indicators were not fair and accurate representations of the actual work being done at alternative schools. So what they tasked to us was the question of how could the school accountability system in California best measure and recognize success at alternative schools?
So to answer that question for them, we then divided up that larger question into 3 research questions for ourselves. The first is what type of students do alternative schools serve? So there's a general narrative that these students tend to be from needier populations, they may be more students of color, they may be more likely to be an English language learner or to be in a special ed population, but when we ask for numbers, no one seemed to be able to give us an idea of what the difference was between populations that went to alternative schools and populations that went to traditional schools. The second question was, how do these students enroll in alternative schools? So what are the reasons they pursue that alternative school education, because it is a choice that they make? And then how are the pathways they enter those schools? And then the third was, how do alternative schools impact student performance and outcomes? So for that, we did a quantitative analysis looking at students who enrolled in alternative schools and seeing how different metrics of success or performance changed once they enrolled and once they went back to traditional schools. We had both qualitative and quantitative methods. So we started out interviewing district staff at San Jose Unified who worked with alternative schools. Then we moved on to the schools themselves, spent some time at Broadway and Learning Options, which Anne-Marie mentioned were the two main umbrella schools that served alternatives, or the main two alternative school organizations within San Jose Unified. So we talked to their administrators, we talked to teachers, we talked to students and counselors to get an idea of how they define success, why students chose to attend these schools, what were their experiences like. And then to square that narrative, what we did was we looked at student data to see if all the different things that were being said could be found in the data as well. And we were able to find a lot of cooperation between both sets of qualitative and quantitative data.
Okay, so to address research question 1, as Amanda said, we had this qualitative picture, kind of anecdotal picture of the kinds of students who end up in alternative schools, but without the evidence-based quantitative backup, the quantitative evidence. So that is what we did for research question 1, what kinds of students do alternative schools serve? The first thing that we looked at was a demographic profile of students enrolled in alternative versus traditional schools in San Jose Unified. You can see the differences up here. Traditional schools are on the left, alternative schools on the right. And the most marked difference is that a much higher proportion of Hispanic students are enrolled in alternative schools, about 75% compared to 50% in traditional schools. In addition to that, there is a much smaller population of white students enrolled in alternative schools, and also a much smaller proportion of Asian students. One kind of side note that we discussed when we had our meeting with the state board was that the population of Black students enrolled in traditional and alternative looks about the same. It doesn't look drastically different here, and I think that is something that we talked about with our supervisor, essentially noting that given the population of students in San Jose Unified, it's much more likely to see that marked difference in Hispanic student population versus Black students. This graph, the summary is that alternative schools serve high-need populations. The different colors represent different special student groups. The orange are students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch, meaning they come from lower income families. The blue lines are students who are classified as English learners, and the red are special education. The thick lines are the proportion of students that are enrolled in traditional schools from that group, and the thin lines are the proportion of, alternative. Thin line is traditional schools. So as an example, the orange line's at the top. The thick line is the proportion of students qualifying for free and reduced price lunch who are enrolled in alternative education. Right? There's a higher number from across the entire range of our data set. More students who come from low-income families are enrolled in alternative schools than traditional schools when you look at the proportions. You see that trend is the same, although the proportions are different for all of these special need groups. So overall, even though there's a little bit of variation and a little bit of difference in trend lines, overall we do see that students coming from groups that are identified as having higher needs in their education, a higher proportion of them are enrolled in alternative education. And finally, the last kind of classification of students we looked at were foster and homeless youth. And for both of them, we saw, again, higher proportions of enrollment in alternative education. 23% of foster youth are enrolled in alternative schools compared to 7% of non-foster youth. In San Jose Unified and in general, tracking foster youth is something that's difficult, so the overall number is pretty small, but comparing the proportion is still something that's pretty significant. And similarly with homeless youth, 20% of homeless youth are enrolled in alternative education, while only 7% of non-homeless youth are enrolled in alternative education.
Great, so now that we have an idea of the kind of demographics or information of what types of students are enrolled in alternative schools, we wanted to paint a picture of how students arrive in alternative schools, thinking that an idea of how they arrive to these schools would give us information about how what supports are necessary for their success while in there, and then that could be an indicator of success for an accountability system. So the first thing to note is that students who are referred to alternative schools for three main reasons, the first being academic, the second being behavioral, and the third being some sort of circumstantial stressor or special circumstance. So you'll see those three reasons articulated here on this flowchart. This represents the referral process for for students who choose to enroll in alternative schools. So the first being that some academic need is being expressed in a student. So this could express itself in some potential evidence such as credit deficiency, which is defined by San Jose Unified as students being 40 credits or more behind going into their junior year of high school. So there's behind on credits to a point where they could not reasonably make up those credits while being enrolled in their traditional school. In addition to an academic need, it is possible that behavioral needs are being expressed. It's possible that students may have some emotional trauma or mental health complications that are expressing themselves in behavior issues at school, which could be evidenced by suspensions or expulsion. And then finally, there are circumstantial stressors in students' lives. Oftentimes this could be their foster or homeless youth, they could be newly pregnant teenagers, they could also have full-time work obligations that necessitate them to have a more flexible schooling schedule. And so if there are some circumstantial stressors, we might see evidence of this in terms of attendance or overall school engagement. So for all three of these student needs, the referral process is the same for San Jose Unified. So a school-based counselor will usually identify one of these needs and refer it to SJUSD's Student Services Manager, who oversees all of the cases in the district. At that point, a student hearing is held where relevant stakeholders come to the table, parents, guardians, students, counselors, teachers, and try and make an informed decision for the student. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is the student and their parents' decision if they believe that an alternative learning option is better suited for their child. So most of that data that we gathered was through qualitative interviews with San Jose staff and alternative school staff members. We were able to substantiate these with our quantitative data that we received from San Jose Unified. So we found that alternative school students are more likely to have been suspended in the previous year. So the graph that you're looking at right now has two different types of students. The first is a student who was suspended in the previous year. We wanted to know what happened to that student. So if a student was suspended in the previous year, there's a 15% chance that they moved from a traditional to an alternative school. However, if a student was not suspended in the previous year, there was only a 3% chance that they moved from a traditional to an alternative school. So we can see that quite a sizable portion of students who were suspended the previous year, the result of that suspension was them moving to an alternative school.
So after we understood how students got to alternative schools, we then turned our attention to how do they do when they get there. So the first thing that we wanted to look at was graduation rate. So usually in alternative schools you have an older population of students, so typically 11th or 12th grade students. And so the applicability of graduation rates to alternative schools is kind of foggy. So there's no cohort to really speak of because students are coming later in high school, and so we can't do that 4-year graduation rate that we see as a recommendation from the SSA. And then it's also not really fair to use this cohort graduation rate because we already know these students are off track, right? So we know that they're credit deficient, and so they are inherently at a disadvantage when we're thinking about on-time graduation. So we looked at two potential alternatives to a graduation rate. The first was a 12th grade graduation rate. So if you have a student in your building who's classified as a 12th grader, what's the probability that they will graduate at the end of the school year? And then we also looked at something called the save rate. So I will explain save rates later, so let's go ahead and just look at the 12th grade graduation rate. So 12th grade graduation rates are lower at alternative schools. So if you look at this graph here, the blue line represents the 12th grade graduation rate of a traditional school in San Jose Unified, and then we have the alternative school in red. Not surprising as a finding if we think about the different needs that alternative students have. So in thinking about this, we then turned our attention to save rates. So the save rate we're going to define as a measure of post-secondary outcomes that include graduation, but also include any continued pursuit of an educational or career opportunity. And so just to give you details of what would be included in addition to the traditional graduation outcome and a save rate. So we have students who might have enrolled in an adult education program. We have students who enrolled in college, not necessarily for college credits, but in a high school level or high school diploma level coursework. And we have students who entered some type of this institution for a high school diploma, or students who earned a GED, which is the equivalent to a high school diploma. So we made an indicator for a student that would qualify under the save rate definition, and we then looked at the difference between traditional and alternative schools in the save rate calculation, and we can see that the gap between these schools closes, and that alternative schools have had a more steady upward trend in the save rate measure, which means that they're looking at different options to help a student continue their education besides just the traditional definition of graduation, right? They may notice that students may just need their GED to move on to the workforce or to do other things, and so they're helping their students look at different options for post-secondary or post-high school. Another thing that we wanted to look at was proficiency on assessments. So that was the second category within ESSA. This also has a very difficult applicability to alternative schools because the Smarter Balance, which is the high school exam that's given in California, is only given in 11th grade. So the growth that we see or the score that we see an 11th grader get in alternative school might not be attributed to the alternative school at all. It would be really difficult to have to catch that 11th grader right at the time that they would be in the alternative school, and so this presented a lot of different complications. So when we were interviewing our the educators at the alternative schools in San Jose Unified, we wanted to figure out what academic outcome they were aligning success to, and they all talked about high school graduation. So working backward from that definition of high school graduation, we thought about credit accumulation being a possible avenue in which the state could take in measuring academic progress during high school. So we're looking at any sort of growth in credit attainment or being on track as opposed to any sort of proficiency on assessments as being the alternative school indicator here. So to do this, what we did is we created an on-track indicator. So in San Jose Unified specifically, a student has to complete 220 credits to graduate. We divided that by 4 to say that a student to be on track in a given year would have to earn 55 credits. And that 55 is not necessarily a perfect measure because to be on track for graduation in 4 years, if you're already behind, you would have to earn more, but we knew that a student earning 55 credits would at least be doing better than they had before, right? Because if they had been earning 55 credits, they were doing well enough to graduate high school in 4 years. And so we looked at students who were switching from different types of schools. So if you switch from traditional to alternative, we tagged you. If you were staying still in your type of school, we tagged you, and then we also looked at students who were switching from alternative to traditional schools. And we found that when students made that switch the next school year, they were more likely to be on track by about 25 percentage points. So alternative schools are really helping students to be on track and to gain those credits that they need to graduate. When students are switching from an alternative back to a traditional school, that gain is lost. So they're more than 25 percentage points less likely to be on track within that next school year. So these are the breakdown for different racial groups, and you see that that holds. And looking at special student groups that we talked about before, the special ed students, the English language students, and the students who qualify for free or reduced lunch, we do see the same growth trend, and then we also see the same reversion trend when they're moving from alternative back to, or when they're moving back to traditional schools from alternative schools. Also, when students are not changing schools, we see about a 0% of somewhere around 0% change. So their progress is about still. So, and looking at our non-academic indicators, we actually found these indicators to be highly applicable to alternative schools. So suspension rate would make sense because a lot of our students who are entering alternative schools are entering because they've been referred because of some type of behavioral need. And then we're also looking at chronic absenteeism, which made sense with our population as well. So we wanted to see how alternative schools affected suspension rates and affected chronic absenteeism. So this is the same kind of setup as before. So in absences, we see a decrease when students enter alternative schools. And this is total absences, which is how the state would define chronic absenteeism, both excused and unexcused. So we see overall, except for Black students, a drop in absences when they switch from traditional school to alternative school. When they then move back to a traditional school, we are seeing more absences. And then that same trend holds true for the special groups we're looking at as well. The special ed, the English learners, the students who qualify for free or reduced lunch. So a big question for us was then suspension rates. Well, we see that when a student moves from a traditional to an alternative school, they are far less likely to be suspended. So they're about overall 17 percentage points less likely to be suspended. That's true for all different racial groups, which is significant because suspensions tend to be correlated with race. However, when they move back to traditional schools, they're then more likely to be suspended in that next given year. So all students who are moving back are more likely to be suspended when they're moving back to traditional schools. And that trend, again, holds true for the special groups we looked at.
All right, so that was a lot of findings coming at you. So you can take a breath now, it's over. But taking these findings, how could we transfer them to recommendations, knowing again that our policy challenge was to find differentiated but fair and accurate indicators for alternative schools. So come back to this trusty chart. We're going to talk about the 4 different recommendations that we'll make for alternative school indicators. So the first, instead of a 4-year cohort graduation rate, we are recommending that the state board look into 12th grade graduation rates. So again, if a student is a 12th grader, what is the likelihood that they graduate that year? And then also save rates. So something to note about save rates is that we do want to recognize that all of the relevant stakeholders at all of the alternative schools really talked about high school graduation being their #1 goal, and it is possible that if introducing a save rate, that could distract from that goal, or it could reduce the importance of high school graduation. So the state board is definitely going to be looking into what qualifies as a positive exit code that would be incorporated into save rates, but still this high school graduation rate is kind of like the North Star for most of these schools. And then second, instead of the proficiency on assessments, we are going to recommend some sort of measurement of if students are on track to graduate or not, or their credit attainment. So we really see this measure as being a preventative measure. So if a student isn't graduating, that's something that we'll know reactively. But preventively, we can track if students are attaining credits at a higher rate at an alternative school, because in theory, if they're credit deficient, they should be obtaining credits at a higher rate at an alternative school. We do also want to note that credit attainment, this is something we'll talk about in a bit, is something that's not necessarily standardized, and it's possible that by emphasizing this particular indicator, we could be emphasizing that credits are given out more freely and aren't actually representative of student work or learning occurring. So that's something that the state board also expressed to us last week that was a concern of theirs.
Our next recommendation is focused on these non-academic indicators. Already in traditional schools, reports of suspension rates and chronic absenteeism are required. And seeing the trends from our findings, we felt that these were two areas that held particularly true and should be extended to an alternative school accountability system. Specifically because we know that the students who are enrolling and choosing to attend alternative schools have higher suspension rates, higher chances of having behavioral problems in their traditional environment, and have higher reported absences. Seeing not only that those students are have these issues in traditional schools, but then seeing positive behavioral change once the switch to an alternative school, seeing those positive behavioral changes happening is something that we felt was a really strong indicator of both higher engagement and likely a much deeper buy-in to their education, seeing that perhaps the environment in the alternative school is actually meeting their needs in a more substantial and more meaningful way. So that's something that we essentially carried over from the traditional school accountability metrics, seeing that in general, at least for the students in San Jose whose data we had access to, we saw positive trends, and seeing that as something that we think alternative schools are doing well and should be counted in their successes. Finally, we are not touching English language learners. English language learning and issues of assessment and classification and all of that is a very complicated policy matter all by itself, and is mixing that with alternative schools is something that the state board is going to have a lot of fun trying to figure out in the future, but we essentially left it beyond looking at those demographic statistics and success outcomes. We basically decided it was beyond the scope of what we were able to complete with our data and our time frame.
So our recommendations come with two recommendations also for further study in order for us to have confidence that these are for sure fair and accurate indicators. So the first is that the state should look into standardizing credit deficiency in that definition, and also look into some type of standardization of credit accumulation policies. So when we were asking the different alternative school professionals about credit deficiency, they gave us a definition of how they deemed it, but it wasn't coded anywhere. There's no way for us to look at a student and see if they would have been deemed credit deficient or not. And then also, looking at the two schools, both Broadway and Learning Options, they both had different ways of awarding credit. So one school, the teacher awarded credit on a weekly basis for the work that was done and the learning that happened. And then at Broadway, you could get different amounts of credit for different grades. And then looking at the grand state of California, each district can decide what a credit is. Each state can say how many credits are required for graduation, how many should be taken in a given year. And so if we were to use this as an indicator, the state has to have some type of institutional knowledge